I call the Minister.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it is a great honour for me to stand here as both the Member for Baulkham Hills and the Minister for Veterans Affairs to take note of the Centenary ANZAC debate. In doing so, Mr Deputy Speaker, can I acknowledge the presence of the House, the former Shadow Minister for Veterans Affairs, Member for Fairfield, who joined with me yesterday in ministerial statements to acknowledge the service of the Vietnam veterans that paid tribute to this chamber by attending. Can I also, Mr Deputy Speaker, thank all members of the House who were part of that debate yesterday, who gave the Vietnam veterans an unsolicited standing ovation. I can report back to the House that I've spoken to some of those that attended yesterday who found that to be probably the most emotional experience they've had in their post-military service. Because, as you know, Mr Deputy Speaker, those very men that were here yesterday having lunch with me, attending the debate and acknowledging the House's commemoration, didn't always get treated with the heroics that they deserved. Some of them have given me stories of their return from Vietnam, as I mentioned in the ministerial statement yesterday, that they couldn't march on Anzac Day because the RSL itself didn't recognise their service, that they had been vilified, criticised and indeed ignored by not only civil society but the entire veterans community. It is a stain on both the RSL but our own community that those Vietnam veterans had to wait until 1987 to get their welcome home parade. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, can I report also back to the House that over lunch yesterday it was made very clear by the Acting President of the RSL, John Haynes, to me, that his main focus as the Acting President of the RSL and as a Vietnam veteran is to ensure that those contemporary veterans that are returning from Iraq, Afghanistan, from the Solomon Islands, East Timor, from the Western Sahara, from Bougainville, that they won't be treated in the same way that those who had been part of the Vietnam contingent were treated. Mr Deputy Speaker, can I also open my remarks by acknowledging the work of the Premier in supporting our veterans in this period of the Centenary of ANZAC. The Premier and I had a very interesting discussion on my appointment as Parliamentary Secretary, because he stood up at a function and he said that he was to celebrate the Centenary of ANZAC. And I initially had a discussion with him and I said, I don't know if we actually celebrate the Centenary of ANZAC, I don't know if we actually celebrate this particular period. We should commemorate it. But quite rightly, and as usual, the Premier came back with a response which put me to shame. The Premier had said, yes, but we do celebrate courage and valour. And I am quite happy to stand corrected when it comes to celebrating the Centenary of ANZAC, because the Premier is probably right. When we hosted those Vietnam veterans yesterday, when the Premier and the Governor and other members of the Parliament held a reception at Government House on Saturday afternoon for those Vietnam veterans, when the Premier attended the ramp ceremony only a few short weeks ago for those 30-odd veterans who were finally returned home to be buried in Australia, we are celebrating their courage. We are celebrating their valour. We are celebrating something that makes them different to normal citizens in our society. And I think the Premier is quite right to correct me, and I think he's quite right to identify the fact that this part of our history is something for us to provide reflection on in a celebratory nature. Mr Deputy Speaker, can I also pay tribute to the Premier for not only his support for the Centenary of ANZAC marquee project for the people of New South Wales, and that is, of course, the renovation of the War Memorial in Hyde Park. Members of the House may not be aware, and I know the member for Fairfield is acutely aware because he sat through as many committee meetings with me as I did, that the War Memorial in Hyde Park built in the 1930s by public subscription amongst, as well as support from state and federal governments, as well as the local city of Sydney, had originally been planned to include a water feature, and that was part of the ANZAC commemoration. That was going to be part of the memorial to our World War I contingent. But unfortunately, the Great Depression came along, and public subscriptions and indeed revenues from the taxpayers dried up. And so that war memorial has never been completely finished. That memorial did not include the water feature that was originally planned for it. And now, some 80 years later, as we commemorate the Centenary of ANZAC, that war memorial will be finished. And I have to offer my sincere thanks on behalf of the veterans community and their families to the Premier, and indeed the Commonwealth, and particularly the Treasurer, who made the whole process of gaining that $18 million from the New South Wales government so easy. I went into a number of meetings making sure that everybody present knew that I believe this was probably one of the most significant public infrastructure projects of this term of Parliament. And I stand by that, even though I'm looking to enjoy the $8 billion railway that's coming through my electorate in a few short years. I do believe that the veteran community and their families deserve the completion of this particular war memorial. And I'm delighted that so many new features are going to be included in that memorial. I'm delighted that there will be a public space for reflection. I'm delighted that there will be a library. I'm delighted that there will be a contemporary artistic reflection of those symbols that we hold so dearly as part of the ANZAC story. I'm delighted that there'll be a place there that will commemorate and remember the often forgotten small country towns and hamlets that offered up their sons only to die on the battlefields of Western France and Gallipoli. I'm delighted that the memorial will form part of not only the story of the past, but the story of the future, a nation that we've become that's so committed to freedom, to democracy and the sense of fair play. Mr Deputy Speaker, it's not just the memorial that the Premier has given his support for, and something that the veterans community is grateful for. His commitment to employing veterans in the New South Wales government is one that has now attracted support and interest from around the country. I've now got ministers from as far away as Western Australia asking me how the securing our veterans' future policy will work, and I have to pay tribute to my predecessor in this portfolio, Victor Dominello, and indeed the Premier, for their commitment, because they know, for all the bricks and mortar that we lay down to remember our veterans, nothing is more important than the contemporary welfare of our veterans. The best way of us to be able to secure our veterans' future is to give them a sense of worth. And we all know, as members of this House, that a sense of worth comes with a job. We all know that a sense of worth comes with a feeling of security, of self-determination, and a sense of worth comes only with the idea of making a positive contribution to our society. And for that reason, I think this policy that the Premier has offered our veterans across New South Wales is one that will be well remembered, and for his commitment to our veterans, he'll be well regarded and always welcome in the veterans community. But it's not just the War Memorial. It's not just securing our veterans' future. As I've said before, and the Premier is probably too embarrassed to boast about it, but I don't have the same sense of humility that he has. I think that the Premier's commitment to bring Cabinet forward at 6 a.m. on the day that those veterans were returning and the ramp ceremony was held at RAF Base Richmond showed, in my mind, how much of a decent man he was. There was criticism of federal politicians who didn't turn up there on that particular occasion. And I know that Bill Shorten and Malcolm Turnbull have made comments about that, and I think that they should be set aside. But what needs to be acknowledged from our veterans community is the fact that the Premier knew personally how important that ramp ceremony was to the widows of those veterans, to the families of those that never came home. And in one of the greatest military injustices since Breaker Morant, those families were denied that right when they fell on the battlefield all those years ago. And I am delighted that our military and those in command of our military forces now realise that the least we can do to our veterans who have fallen on overseas fields is to bring them home and give them full military honours as we lay them to rest. Mr Acting Speaker, Mr Deputy Speaker, in acknowledging our Centenary of ANZAC, I think it is important to highlight the fact that the Australian Defence Force is not one that has actively gone out to seek conflict. The history of our nation, which I think our military history is such an important cornerstone of that story, says to us that we are a nation of democracy and peace. That story says to us, and will say to those in the future, that we are a nation of peace and tranquility. We are a nation that seeks to ensure stability and freedom in our nation. And it is no coincidence, when you look at the story of Australia, that we are not only a nation that boasts that our military personnel are not inclined to go and invade and to initiate conflict, but we are also a nation that, in that parallel story, highlights our longevity and commitment to democracy. We are one of only very few nations who can boast a century of democracy, and it is no coincidence that those other nations that can boast a century of democracy include New Zealand, the United Kingdom and Canada. Four, I might add, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I know you concur with this particular point, four of them who also boast a commitment to constitutional monarchy. And it is certainly one of those ingredients that allows us to ensure the stability of our military forces and indeed this very parliamentary democracy that we stand in today. Mr Deputy Speaker, I think it is important for us in acknowledging the ANZAC story and taking note of the centenary to reflect on the service of members of this House. And indeed, one of the great privileges of serving in this House is to be able to pay tribute every day to the memorial that stands before us to George Braun and Edward Larkin, two serving members of this chamber who thought so much of their community that they were prepared to lie down their lives in service of their nation. Those two gentlemen, Mr Deputy Speaker, should be continuously celebrated for their valour and their contribution to two great institutions, being the New South Wales Parliament and the Australian Imperial Forces. Mr Deputy Speaker, but over the course of the century, they are not just the only two that have served in our military on overseas operations. I'm reminded when I worked in this place some 20 years ago that Ian McManus was a member of the government. Ian, who you may remember, Mr Deputy Speaker, was the Labor member for Bulli, not somebody that I'm necessarily inclined to advocate for, but Ian, as a young man, served with the Royal Australian Navy and was decorated with the American Unit Citation for his service in the Battle of Dragon, served in Vietnam, and I understand also in the Malay Emergency. It wasn't just Ian, of course. We had Charlie Lin, a famous member of the Vietnam contingents who served not only in Vietnam but continues to serve as an advocate for the memory of the Kokoda Trail and has a wonderful organisation that takes young people over that trail. We had, of course, my former boss, Peter Collins, who actually did his military service back to front. He served as a member of this place for 20 years and more, and then on retirement from this place went back to the regular permanent Navy and served in Iraq as part of the international operations to secure the peace and security of the people of Iraq, and I think that that service should also be celebrated. Indeed, in the Cabinet we have Anthony Roberts. As modest as he is about his military service, he should not be forgotten that Anthony, on the call, served as a peacekeeper overseas. There are so many stories in this chamber, Mr Deputy Speaker, that I'm delighted to be able to boast that we have, I think, one of the wonderful stories that can be complemented as we commemorate the Centenary of ANZAC, and I think that also highlights that as politicians around the world often get criticised as being the people that just send soldiers off to war and never fight them, I think this House can stand proud as being able to say we're not like that. Mr Deputy Speaker, it is appropriate, of course, to highlight the fact that more than 600 members of the Australian community died as we fought in the Boer War, before the Centenary, before the ANZAC story even was thought of. Mr Deputy Speaker, I think that as this chamber pauses to take note of the Centenary of ANZAC, we have to reflect on all its service. The 115,000 who were killed or wounded in the First World War, 60,000 killed, and of course the rest wounded. The 30,000 that were taken prisoners of war in the Second World War. The 39,000 that were killed in the Second World War. The 3,600 that were killed or wounded in Vietnam, and particularly noting, of course, the 518 who never returned home. Those injured and killed in Korea, in Afghanistan and Iraq. Mr Deputy Speaker, these aren't just statistics, these are families and they need to be remembered. Mr Deputy Speaker, can I just conclude by reminding the House that we have a number of wonderful scholarships that are complementing the Centenary of ANZAC. The Premier's very own scholarship, which will continue as an annual event. This year went to battlefields in France. They've previously gone to Long Tan, Korea, and of course European theatres. But they are also being run concurrently with the Club's New South Wales Premier Scholarship, and I was delighted to take 6 students with Nathan Rees, the former Labor Premier, and Anthony Ball from Clubs New South Wales to Greece and the Western Front in April this year. Part of that contingent, of the obligations of that contingent, were to report back to their communities, and they were chosen, as many members are aware, by way of an essay competition, 1,000 words, which I think was quite remarkable. Mr Deputy Speaker, as you know, I could go on forever about the Centenary of ANZAC. It is something that I think every member of this chamber is passionate about, and I'm delighted to see how many of them have embraced this particular part of our nation's history. I thank all those members that have invited me as Minister for Veterans Affairs to the various war memorials in their electorates, and I'm delighted that those grants to improve those war memorials will continue. Mr Deputy Speaker, I ask the chamber to take note of the Centenary of ANZAC.